Hello and welcome to Lettres d'Amérique, a virtual series featuring essential American literary voices. I'm Alice McCrum, Programs Manager at the American Library in Paris. Bonjour et bienvenue à Lettres d'Amérique, une série virtuelle avec les nouvelles voix de la littérature américaine. Je suis Alice McCrum, responsable des programmes à la Bibliothèque américaine de Paris. Tonight, I have the pleasure and delight of hosting Tommy Orange in conversation with Robert Warrior about Tommy Orange's debut novel, There. Before we get started, some brief words from Jessica Banuls, cultural attaché, who joins us this evening on behalf of the US Embassy and consulates in France.
Je suis Jessica Banuls, attachée culturelle à l'ambassade des États-Unis d'Amérique en France. C'est un plaisir d'être avec vous aujourd'hui pour inaugurer cette série de 5 discussions avec les nouvelles voix de la littérature américaine. Je tiens tout d'abord à saluer l'engagement de la American Library in Paris et de Festival America dans ce projet. Ce projet vise à donner un aperçu de la société américaine contemporaine et de ses similitudes et différences avec la France à travers la littérature. Il s'agit de l'un de nombreux programmes culturels et éducatifs organisés par l'ambassade et par nos consulats en France en partenariat avec des institutions françaises. Nous œuvrons ainsi au renforcement des liens d'amitié qui unissent nos deux pays tout en permettant une meilleure connaissance de la culture américaine en France. C'est la littérature qui est à l'honneur ce soir et tout au long de ce mois de septembre. Je suis convaincue que le rôle de la littérature est fondamental dans la construction de notre imaginaire, mais aussi dans la déconstruction des stéréotypes. Le président Barack Obama précisait cela même lors d'un entretien avec François Busnel en novembre 2020. La bonne littérature vous sort de vous-même et vous met à la place des personnes dont la vie est totalement différente de la vôtre. Et c'est ainsi que vous découvrez qui vous êtes réellement. Ces mots nous rappellent l'importance de la littérature dans la construction de notre identité et dans notre compréhension et acceptation de l'altérité. Nous avons développé la série Lettres d'Amérique, en partenariat avec Festival America et l'American Library, afin de vous faire découvrir les États-Unis à travers le regard de plusieurs écrivains qui examinent certaines problématiques auxquelles notre pays est confronté, dont beaucoup sont communes avec la France. La sélection des 5 auteurs participants à Lettres d'Amérique met à l'honneur la diversité culturelle, ethnique et linguistique qui constitue la véritable richesse de notre pays. Tommy Orange, Jenny Zhang, Leila Lalami, Yagyasi et Nanakwame Adjebranya sont des incarnations des nouvelles voix de la littérature américaine. Veuillez noter que leurs opinions ne représentent pas nécessairement la politique officielle des États-Unis. Et c'est précisément pour cette raison que nous souhaitons que vous les écoutiez. Leur engagement et leur art contribuent à bâtir une des plus chères valeurs américaines que nous partageons avec la France, la liberté d'expression, qui permet de célébrer les différences et de s'ouvrir encore davantage sur le monde. Et bien sûr, l'amour de la bonne littérature. Je laisse à présent la parole à Alice McCrum, votre hôte, et je vous souhaite une belle soirée. Merci.
And thank you again to the US Embassy and consulates in France for your support. Now over to Robert and Tommy, who will be on the English channel. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us at Lettres d'Amérique this evening. I'm so delighted to have you and host you.
Welcome to our event for this evening. I want to start by just thanking Alice and Audrey, everyone at the American Library in Paris, and everyone at the US Embassy as well for sponsoring this evening. Especially want to thank them for giving me this opportunity. I feel like I'm in the catbird seat tonight, but I have the best seat in the house. Wish we were in Paris for it, but alas, we'll have to wait for that. So tonight I have the pleasure of having a conversation with Tommy Orange, who as I think you know, is the author of the novel There that came out in 2018 to lots of acclaim. That's winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award and others that are really a terrific notice of what is just a stunning literary debut. Rather than go into lots and lots of depth about all of that, I thought I'd just kind of get into the questions that that I have for Tommy. And Tommy, I guess the question I wanted to start with is about having watched a bunch of your public readings, which I've really enjoyed doing, and sometimes really small crowds and larger crowds and things like that. But that I've just been struck by your sincerity in thanking those who've taken the time, the energy, as well as the money it takes to buy a book or to get on the bus and go to the library to get it. You have that sort of sincerity in thanking them for reading your work. I've also seen you say that you're not really that public of a person, so I wonder how COVID and formats like this one have impacted how you think about your audience or your audiences. And do you find yourself missing the fact that, do you wish this was face to face? Do you prefer these things to be, online like this, where you can pop on and then pop off? But just talk a little bit about your audiences and how that's changed here during the time of COVID.
Sure. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Alice, and for everyone who's putting this together, making it happen behind the scenes, and for everyone who came. I certainly wish we were in Paris for this together in person, and that's one of the in-person situations that I wish could happen. I got to go to France a few different times for the book, for the translation. It was one of the faster translations. And I loved it there, and the French audience has been very kind, and it's been cool to know that people can connect to the book there. I have cousins in the south of France, in Bordeaux, and I know there's supposed to be some kind of guttural, throaty sound at the end of that, but I can't do it yet. So I got to spend time with my cousins, and my family goes back in the south of France on my mom's side. So that was a really cool experience. I just had a dream about my cousin from there last night. So I didn't like, when I first went out on tour, I was terrified. You sell a book, and it all happened pretty fast for me right out of college, out of the Institute of American Indian Arts. As a writer, you're a private person doing your thing in private, and the sort of the playing out of your work happens in people's minds in private. That's the reading experience. It's like you do it all in private, and then you have it all play out in private. And that is the nature of the writer and reader communion. So to be thrust into, the sort of performance of self and author was, it was pretty traumatic for me, because I never liked public speaking. But I did make an effort to do it when I was at the Institute of American Indian Arts, to read when I could, because I was told that's important. And so the audience initially seemed to be a lot of old white people on the East Coast. That was sort of how it started. And it was, there's a lot of pretty frustrating questions, and people that felt pretty far behind in terms of having to unpack just like a question that seems innocent enough to them could be hurtful, or like you'd have to spend a little bit of time unpacking it. And so it wasn't until halfway through the tour that we ended up back in Oakland, and I got to do some events with family members and community members, and got to experience some feedback from people who I was writing about, and that was a really cool experience. So so I wish I was there with you here, and then I could sort of feel the audience as I'm talking, because the Zoom sometimes it's speaking into the void, and you don't have a feel for audience, and I don't know if I'm rambling as well as when I'm in person.
I just always assume that I'm rambling, and I could probably listen to you ramble for a long time. So you brought up IAI, the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, and I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about IA and how you got there, and who your teachers were when you were there, and have you had a chance to read there or read for kind of your cohort of students who were there with you?
Yeah, so I didn't know about the school. I know it's been around since the 70s. But I had no idea. I lived in New Mexico a couple different times, and I hadn't really been aware of it. Especially hadn't been aware, if somebody had mentioned it, I hadn't been aware of an MFA program. And I found out about it by chance. I was teaching a digital storytelling workshop, and there was a poet in the workshop, and sort of between on a break during the workshop that I was teaching, she had gotten an MFA. I don't know from where, but she found out that I got into this somewhat prestigious artist in residency called McDowell, and she sort of freaked out. I didn't actually know. Sorry, I got a dog barking. I didn't know that their residency was prestigious. I had just seen it on another Native author's resume, and I applied on a whim, and I got in. And so she was like, "You got to get into an MFA." And she knew that I had a young son at the time, and that I couldn't really just like relocate to an MFA program anywhere. So she Googled in front of me on our break in this workshop, low residency MFAs, because she knew it was such a thing. And then when IAIA came up, I was like, whoa, this is a thing. Like there's a Native school and it's MFA. And I had sort of been anti-MFA because I felt like it was a voice killer, and like writers had been becoming writers for decades on their own, just from reading and diving into the writing. And I thought, like, the MFA is going to teach you how to write this very specific style that I'd seen, like, from reading books in bookstores. And you see and yet another author came out of an MFA and they wrote a New York novel, and it sounds the same to me. So I had avoided it, and then I got into the program, and I saw the faculty, and I applied while I was at that residency and started the next summer. And it was really an incredible experience, and not like any other MFA experience that I would have had if I went somewhere else. And mainly that was a community thing. That was understanding that I was in the context of all these other Native writers, and you didn't have to explain yourself. And we got to hear each other read and talk about craft within the context of being a Native writer specifically. So it was really a life-changing experience for me. It was. I had written about half the novel as I got into the program, and then I finished about half the novel in the program, and then finished the novel after the program.
So you were already writing at that point. I know you worked in a bookstore, and you talked about reading books that were really influential on you, and it's a very writerly sounding sort of origin story of how you got started writing, and how you kept going, and then you went into the MFA program at IAIA, and it seems like that must have helped you propel in certain ways, right? Learning about various sorts of things. I was just really struck by this one scene towards the end of when Tony Loneman is imagining himself at 4 years old, and before he goes to kindergarten, he's listening to his grandmother singing Cheyenne hymns while she does the dishes. And this is a character who has fetal alcohol syndrome, which is has a pretty serious impact on someone's consciousness. And as I was rereading that passage, thinking about ahead to this interview, I just thought this must have been incredibly hard to write, to capture all of these different sorts of things. And it really showed that it really did show that craft. And can you just talk a little bit about, if not that scene, other ones about where you do these really complicated things and you're using images and sounds and also consciousness of people that you're not? I mean, you're not them at all, right? We're nobody but each other anyway. But how did you do that?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. You've got a lot of nice compliments that are embedded in your question, so I appreciate that. I don't want to let those go by unnoticed. the funny thing about Tony Loneman specifically is the voice was so distinct and clear the way it came out. Both the he sort of bookends there. Is at the beginning, after the prologue, it's the first chapter with a voice, and then we end it with Tony. And a lot of his stuff came out really fast and really clear, and just like, this was Tony and this was his experience. So I don't want to like mystify the writing in any way by saying like it just came to me, because that sounds crazy, because there's a lot of hard work that goes into writing. But I think with Tony specifically, there was something about his voice that just came out really easily. Whereas somebody like Opal Viola Victoria Bearshield, who I wrote 2 chapters of her, and one is on Alcatraz, and that one took me like 4 years to really get right. And so that, the work that goes into that it's easier to talk about, because the Tony stuff, Tony was one of the first voices that came to me when I first thought of the whole novel. And I had ideas embedded in Tony's voice that I wanted to explore, like what people think intelligence is. We equate intelligence with memorization and obedience, and like getting into these 10 schools that we think, oh, this guy's smart because he got into this or that school. And we don't give credence to all these other kinds of intelligences. So I wanted this character who would be seen just from his actual, what he looks like. People assume he's of a lesser intelligence, for him to have this kind of wisdom. He talks about street smarts. So there were things I wanted to write about through the voice, but his voice, for the most part, really came out fast and clear. With Opal, I had taken a group of youth to, as part of a Native Youth Suicide Prevention grant. I worked in nonprofit at the Native American Health Center in Oakland for many years. And we took a group of youth over to Alcatraz and had elders who were there tell them the stories of their time there. And that was where I got the perch. The idea for like, what would it have been like for a kid to experience this whole thing? That, I eventually did research, which included reading your book, Robert, and I very much appreciated it. And so, the 4 years trying to get this voice down had to do with where this voice and perspective was coming from in the context of Alcatraz. And there was, the way that you write about it is, it encapsulates sort of the main characters and what happened and who was there. And what I was wanting to write about was the effect on a kid. And so writing it in past tense and having it try to keep its innocence in the voice, it just took a really long time. There was a lot of different drafts for that one. And I really just had to keep going back to wanting it to have enough perspective that it had this past tense sort of encapsulating voice, but also to keep sort of this innocence of a kid's perspective of what it would have been like.
Yeah, just I'll follow up on that just with Alcatraz. I mean, some of that is really hard to write in my experience of writing about it, because there's a way that you can really pull back from saying, oh, this is a negative thing about Native communities, and oh, this is a character that, boy, if I really write that in the way I see it, it's going to people are going to get mad at me, or I'm going to feel like I'm not really getting at the depth of who that person really is. But then you realize, I mean, this is writing that book with Paul Smith, Like a Hurricane. We just found out, and I give a lot of credit to Paul to say, every Native person knows this character already. Anybody who knows the Native world already knows that person you're writing about. So when you're avoiding writing the truth about it, you start pulling punches on somebody being really brash, or somebody, having some sort of negative personality trait. Say, everybody already knows that person. So why avoid it? Why not write it truly? And then maybe you're actually showing people, hey, books are for you too, or honesty's for you too. So I really appreciated that about Opal's character and about those scenes at Alcatraz, which are really serious ones. I'm wondering, that's a tough audience, the Alcatraz vets, people who were there. Like, have you heard from people who were there, and what do they think about how you wrote about it, and then their experience and how you represented it?
Yeah, there was a few different people. There was one woman, I don't know if she was there, but she feels like she feels as if she were there. She's definitely like a part of the people who, she knows the people who were there if she wasn't there herself. She stood up at one of the events I had in the Bay Area, and she said thank you to me in this public setting. She's an elder in the community, and said that she felt like my book helped her understand her kids better. And that wasn't Alcatraz feedback, but that was like reading Oakland native perspective, and that was a really big moment for me to have nailed something that actually, like, practically helped somebody in their life. There's another woman who told a story when we took the youth there, that worked at the Native American Health Center, who, she didn't give me feedback. A lot of people are like really like gracious about the fact that I had a successful book, and they're not really coming at it with a critical lens, and they're not literary people, and they're not I'm sure there's a lot of people that have critiques out there, both from an experiential point of view and a critical point of view, but the people that I tend to encounter are like community members that I know and love, and it's a lot of positivity. And so I know what you're talking about in terms of the hard group, and there's people that have a lot at stake in what I'm writing about. And I did my best to do the work on the craft level to have it be good writing and have it be good storytelling, and whatever criticisms that people have, I did my best at what literature can try to do. But it's not the real thing. It's not what people went through, and that's not what it was trying to be either.
When I first started teaching Native literature back in the early 90s, I was always telling students, you're not buying a travel guide to the Native world. You're reading a novel, and it's just like in the same way that if you are going to the South, you don't want to, maybe you want to read Faulkner before you do it, but it may not be the best way to find out where's the best motel or what's the, buy a travel guide for that, and, buy a novel if you want to get something else, which is unique to that novel.
Yeah, to me, what novels do that I've always loved is they explore consciousness. They explore the interior. And I think if you want a map of the interior, it's the name of a Stephen Graham Jones book. You go to literature, and you go to novels for an exploration of consciousness, and that's what I've always loved about it. And like you said, it's not there to be the authority on somebody's experience. It's an exploration of this set of characters' consciousness.
So that makes me think of the title and how complexly related to the overall book it is. They're there, and partly because we're also, we're in Paris, or we wish we were in Paris, talking to people in Paris today, that this is a line from Gertrude Stein, who's a beloved figure in Paris, one of those great American writers that has such an impact in Paris. And you take this line from Gertrude Stein that is, as you say, often almost always taken in a different way than it's actually meant, about Oakland supposedly being kind of an empty place, when that's not what she's saying at all. But for you, and you can talk about that and Stein and your relationship to that, but also it just seems like your own relationship to what it means to be there, and the kind of the there-ness of the people in the book and their consciousness. They're there in their own consciousness. They are there in Oakland. You do have the thing in that very end part where it seems like the last "they're there" in the novel is the "they are there." It's the contraction of "they are" and "they're" together, right? They are there, and it's like this statement about, doesn't matter if you see people or not, doesn't mean that they're not there. And it doesn't mean they don't have their own there in that place. And it seems like so much of that is wrapped up in the different consciousnesses you portray. So I guess I'm asking about the there-ness and how, when did that arrive for you as part of the aesthetic of the book, part of what you were driving at, and how you put it together?
Sure, thank you. I mean, first, I think I have to come clean with everyone. I'm not a Gertrude Stein reader. I certainly have read, I've read lots of her sentences, but I cannot claim to be any kind of Stein reader. I find her fairly difficult to read, pretty circuitous, and sonically very interesting. But on a readability level, a little bit difficult for me. So I found the quote. I was doing I got a storytelling grant or cultural arts grant from the city of Oakland, just like the character Dean. And that's a very autobiographical part of the book where he goes in front of a panel of judges. So I did all of that. In researching both for the novel and for this grant, I had been searching for what other authors from Oakland had to say about Oakland. This was when I found the Gertrude Stein quote. You have Jack London, who mostly writes about the wild, and I'm writing an urban novel. And then you have Gertrude Stein, who only writes about not writing about Oakland. So this was the context for me finding this quote. Was just doing some research on what other people had to say about Oakland and thinking about I had been trying to do a storytelling project, but it just turned into the novel, and the novel really took over everything. So, but to me, immediately reading the Stein quote, I read it with a Native lens. So I read it through this experience of being somebody who was born and raised in Oakland, who has a Native father and a white mother, who grew up going back to Oklahoma and sort of like seeing back to Oakland from their perspective, who we were, all these complexities, and growing up around a lot of kids that had, who came from two different cultures, and it's just a very diverse city. And the there-ness of Oakland is just super rich, interesting, and soulful. And so pretty soon after reading the quote and understanding it through this Native context of people living in cities who nobody thinks of Native people living in cities, the there-ness of that feeling, the there-ness of coming to the urban Native community in Oakland by working in it for almost a decade, and sort of understanding the invisibility of it, even in the Native world, or at least in the representation of Native people in popular culture, understanding that the there-ness was not represented, it was not talked about, it was not really there. So almost immediately, I also saw this misinterpreted aspect of people that it's very convenient to think of there not being a there in Oakland if you're trying to gentrify it. It's the perfect space to. It's the same. It's an echo of the wild expanse of the West and the westward expansion manifest destiny. There's nobody there, right? So
right.
That's the way they talked about this whole country. The New World was empty. There were animals called Indians, and the whole thing was there for us to take over. So it's very convenient to think of savages, just like it's very convenient to think of there being no there. If your aim is to occupy and colonize and make the laws of the land literally, and the borders, and then rule. So all of this echo was there in the one line that I read from Stein. And I knew immediately that the title for what I wanted to do, because I knew I wanted to write an Oakland novel and one that was about Native people in Oakland. I knew that the title for the book was in the quote, and it took me about a year to land on the actual there as a title. And then as soon as I found out that I loved it, or realized that I loved it, I Googled it, because I'm like, oh, this has to be something already. Somebody probably wrote a book like this already. And immediately realized it was this Radiohead song, which I had known as track 09, because I pirated that album, which is Hail to the Thief. And the person who uploaded it where I pirated it from had titled that track 0. I mean, it was track 01, track 02, track 03. Right. There's track 09. So I immediately realized that the song itself was if you look at the lyrics, it's very much matches the book thematically. Just because you feel it doesn't mean it's there. And then
Right.
we are accidents waiting to happen is a refrain, and the book is very much like you're sort of dreading what's going to happen at the end.
Right. So that all that makes me think about, I lived in the Bay Area for 8 years, and I remember thinking of it as this famous place where a lot of Native people live. There's relocation that happened there. And I was thinking that when I met people, they would sort of be pining for someplace. They'd have that nostalgic, my there is not here, my there is somewhere else, right? It's a reservation someplace. It's in this past somewhere. And I really got the message really early on from some of those people whose parents had arrived in 1955 or even before that, that they'd kind of made up their minds. Hey, this is where I am. This is my there right here, not someplace else. And then they were kind of asking me to catch up to their reality, which I thought was really cool, to say, what are you going to live out here and just not, and always be thinking someplace else is home? How can you do that? How can that be? And so I thought that was just a really powerful part of what you evoke. And I guess the part you're not saying is that all of that has to be done through writing, right? I mean, if you wanted to write a political essay about Gertrude Stein saying there's no there and how people take that up and it's all about terra nullius would be one thing, but then to write a novel about it, you saw that as being something different. I guess I'm thinking about the way that my friend Alyssa Washuda, talking about nonfiction writing, she says nobody ever notices that somebody wrote this. Nobody notices that there's a lot of hard work that went into this. This was really about craft. And does it bother you when there are interviews or settings when people don't seem to notice that you're a writer and they think that somehow you're automatically doing something? How do you relate to that? Because I know you are definitely a writerly person. You love novels. You can tell by reading there that you love novels and you love literature.
Thank you. Yeah, I think for women and for people of color, unfortunately, a lot of the questions seem to be around, oh, you must have had an interesting life and you're writing about real people. And so they ask you about your life as if you had an inferior imagination and you could only be sort of transcribing an interesting life. And so it has been frustrating for people to be like, well, who are these people? Who did you write about? And everyone in the book is made up. There's obviously composite influence. There has to be. There's a ton of me, and there's some of my family in it by their permission, of course. Especially in the Thomas Frank chapter. It's a very autobiographical chapter. It can be frustrating because there's, I wrote the book over a period of about 8 years from the inception to the publication. And there is a lot of craft. There's a lot of reading your own sentences over and over and over. And for somebody who's naturally self-loathing or self-critical, it can be difficult to keep having the drive to make your sentences better, to make them more readable, to make them more understandable for the reader, to build a world and have it makes coherent sense is a lot of work. And that's the craft, that's the art. And so it can be frustrating to just get the like, oh, your life must have been interesting sort of line of questioning, and not like, if you're looking at a mosaic that somebody's spent, that they've spent years sort of like painstakingly putting it together. You don't get the same level of appreciation. It's more like, okay, so who are these people? And then you just want to know, like, oh, that's my cousin, and that's my friend that I grew up with. And is that even an interesting answer to an uninteresting question? Like, oh yeah, that's just my friend, or that's my mom. I was my mom.
Right. Yeah,
Not even a good question.
Sure. Yeah, I got to say on the Thomas Frank chapter, what you say is maybe the most autobiographical of those. I mean, it's incredibly well crafted. It's just, the imagination it takes to think about where does somebody come from, right, and where are their origins, all the way back eons before they were ever born or thought of. And so that's not just a matter of saying, I was born in, Oakland, California, and did this and did that, right? It's still heavily crafted. So we're almost out of time, and I'm trying to decide what I want to talk about the most. And maybe I'll just give you some choices, because I really am interested in hearing about any of these things. I read your GQ profile of West Studio, which was really interesting, and seeing the connections about the way you think about media and the way you think about being somebody who writes novels, which are, not mass media. I also know you're a musician, and that you do, you play guitar, you play piano. It made me interested in just the relationship of sound specifically to the way that you write. And I guess the last thing is just the prologue of the thing. I'm just really fascinated by the fact that you pulled this off, because it seems like that may be one of the hardest things, is to like introduce a novel with a prologue like that. But it works really beautifully, and people obviously seem to appreciate it. And you really figured out this is kind of needed, and or however you did it. So I don't know. Take your pick of those three sorts of things, and let me know what interests you the most.
I'll quickly answer the sound one. I listen to music all the time when I'm writing.
What do you listen to? That's what I want to know. What do you listen to?
A lot of ambient music. I have a 500 song playlist of different types of, but it's, it can't have lyrics, and it doesn't have a strong melody. Minimalism works really well. Max Richter, I love Max Richter, a lot of his stuff. But then sometimes he's even too melodic for me. So it, there's sometimes it's like very drony stuff. But lately, a song I've been listening to a lot for writing, for whatever reason. I don't know why it does it for me. I'm just trying to find the name of it, because it's The Sinking of the Titanic by Gavin Bryars. It's like a 24-minute song. It's very fascinating, and it's really great to write to. Anyway, so I read my sentences out loud when I get them to a place where I can even do that. That is definitely a part of my writing process. I was a musician before I was a writer, and so I think the sound of sentences is a big part of my sort of like final qualification of do I think this sentence works. It all has to be read aloud, and one of my editing spaces while I was writing there, one of my important editing spaces was a hotel room, because you feel very isolated, and you can kind of like, read your stuff out loud unselfconsciously. So that was, we went a little bit into music and the sound, but you followed it. Oh, the prologue. So the prologue, a lot of people have talked about it as nonfiction, and sort of like putting a nonfiction essay before the book starts. And it's not the way that I wrote it. And I appreciate you saying that about GQ. I do struggle with essay form with nonfiction quite a bit. It feels like pulling teeth for me. But if I tell myself, this is a trick that I think I'm going to try next time I have to write something nonfiction. If I tell myself it's fiction, and I'm sort of writing from a voice that I've convinced myself can speak in a non-fictiony way, then I can do it no problem. But if I'm telling myself that I'm writing an essay or something in nonfiction, it feels really hard for me. So I wrote the thing from a Greek chorus perspective. If you notice, it's not that much in there, but if you notice, the pronouns are we throughout the prologue. So the idea was, before we get to these perspectives, these urban native perspectives, I wanted to contextualize it and have this we voice sort of talk about, well, how did Native people end up in cities? Because I understood it and knew it really well and knew it from the inside, but I also understood that it just was not something that I've seen contextualized or talked about very much. And I wanted to write it for even if you were Native and knew the story of relocation, I wanted to write it in a compelling way that, even if it wasn't new information about the Sand Creek Massacre or Thanksgiving having really awful origins, in a way that was compelling enough that even if you knew it, you would still, it would still sort of sing as a thing to read. So I wrote it in this like chorus way, and then I really didn't get any pushback from it, from the editors, which, you know, I guess it's unconventional for a novel to take on that sort of tone before the novel starts and you get to the characters and the scenes, and editors are so much about like readability and scene work and dialogue and like what's happening with the story. And it's very much doing a whole different thing. But the context, something you have to understand, I think, about there as a book and the time that it lived in, that it grew up in. It sold February after Trump got in, so a month after his inauguration. And I got an agent while Standing Rock was still happening, and we were on national TV in a way that we never are. And you know, it takes these events for us to gain access to, for people to wonder about what's going on with us. It happened at Alcatraz. It happened after Dances with Wolves. And Standing Rock did do some like making people curious. Oh, we need to hear these voices. And you know, the book sold in the context of people wanting what Trump represented, wanting there to be voices that were speaking against what Trump represented, and what, you know, he represents so much that has to do with historically what this country has been, and the insistence on either forgetting or going with the lie that it's always been this great thing, or that he's bringing back the greatness. And I think the prologue specifically sort of was allowed to exist as it was because of the context of in which this book was published. And you know, 5 years before that, I'm not so sure.
That's great, Tommy. Thanks so much for the conversation today. I think we're out of time, so we'll have to continue this in Paris sometime soon, hopefully. And hey, good luck with the rest of your writing. Congratulations on a book that's going to be around for a long time, I think.
Thank you, Robert.
All right.
Thank you for all of your thoughtful and kind questions.
You bet.
Robert, I was just, you took the words out of my mouth. Thank you so much for now you've disappeared. Thank you. You're still here though. I know you're still here. You can jump in and out. It's the magic of Zoom. Thank you so much for being here this evening, and for preparing so thoroughly and thoughtfully. Really, thank you so much for your time. And please stay on the call, because we'll thank you again massively at the end too. Okay. So for those of you who have maybe joined late, who have just joined, hopefully not, but you've stumbled in on Lettres d'Amérique, a virtual series hosted by the American Library in Paris, the US Embassy and Consulates in France, Festival America, and Transfuge Magazine. I'm Alice McCrum, Programs Manager at the library, and much more importantly, this is Tommy Orange, the author of There. We should see it because it's very beautiful. Flashy. And we're now moving on to the part of tonight's event where I will be moderating the chat and posing your questions. So if you haven't posted your question, whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook Live, please go ahead and post it, and I will try and get to as many as possible. So in that regard, I'm going to group, to start with, Tommy, if you don't mind, I'm going to group two together. They're a similar kind of theme. Actually, before we get to the questions, I do just want to remark on how amazingly international our audience is this evening. We have people from Tucson, Arizona, St. Louis, Missouri, East Paris, Reims, Chicago, Paris 1, French Alps, Lyon, Saint-Germain, Latvia, San Francisco, the Colorado Rockies, Tucson, Arizona, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Los Angeles, Oakland, California. So hello to our very varied international audience. Okay, so the questions are as follows. Vanessa asks, what are your thoughts on storytelling as a form of community healing? And Jared asks, there is also something people say sometimes when comforting people, and I was wondering if you thought of the book as a kind of complicated comfort. So the question is about complicated comfort and community healing.
Great combination of those two things, because I think community healing and storytelling, when the context is, you might call dark or heavy, when the story is being told, the hearing of them is definitely comforting, because you feel that you're not alone. But it is a complicated comfort because what you're talking about can be really heavy. in some of these stories when you're talking about relocation and even, you know, Oakland's a tough city, and there's a lot of tough stories that have come out of it. So I definitely, I was doing storytelling work before I started writing the novel, and I saw sort of healing take place in a lot of different communities, a lot of typically, I don't want to say invisible communities, but communities that don't necessarily get listened to, or stories that don't get told as much. I traveled the country with a nonprofit, and I worked with Native communities in Oakland, and I saw the power of people, not only like when they told their own stories in a real way, and then we would teach them how to turn them into short films, like 3-minute short films. The power of them doing it and the transformation of being able to say and voice something that happened to them. I saw the healing power of that, and I saw that happening in community spaces. So before I was doing the novel work, I saw this sort of real time healing happening with storytelling work. So I definitely believe that is something that can happen. I don't know that novels are doing the same thing. And I would never say that I'm like doing healing work as a writer, because that sounds crazy. But I do believe that voicing things that have been unvoiced, I think the life of things on the inside versus the life of things on the outside, which is the difference between silence and something being told, is different, and it's transformative when it comes out. And I think it can be healing for people to tell and to hear stories.
What about for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, I think writing is very hard. It's been really hard. This next book that I'm working on feels much harder to write. And so it can for sure be healing, and it can be thrilling, and it can be cathartic, but it can also be torturous. So it's complicated, I think, when it comes to writing novels, when it comes to any artwork and discipline. It takes discipline. And I would say that's different than like storytelling and community work and people getting together and being able to tell their stories as a community. That's different. And I think it may be easier to call it healing in sort of therapeutic spaces, whereas the artwork stuff is, I think, a bit more complicated.
Yeah. I'm just going to move on. I've just received many questions. Kathleen would like to know, this is specifically about France. I think this is really interesting. So Kathleen says, Tommy, you mentioned having cousins in France from his mother's side of the family. You can confirm this? Okay, great. And they want to know, I'd be interested to know if Tommy has any thoughts about writing on the French and their relations with Native Americans and vice versa, and perhaps how these interactions might differ from typical American ones.
Yeah, I definitely think I could see writing into that in the future. And I don't know that side of history that well. So it would definitely be something I'd have to research in terms of like the French Indian War and in the context of that. And I do think there's a huge difference in the way people think of Native Americans and the way America thinks of Native Americans. It has its own kind of problems. And having done a little bit of traveling, it's been really interesting to see the way the different parts of the world see the original people of this country. So I would for sure write something. There's a family story that sort of my mom's side of the family tells. There's 3 brothers that traveled from the south of France and came by boat on their own and took a train across the country and started up a saloon. The family started up a saloon in Livermore, which is about 20 minutes outside of Oakland. So I think something in the family experience, some story in there would be interesting to write too, and I would be interested in writing it.
Lovely.
But I think there's something that doesn't get talked about, I think, as much. The similar role of colonizers, Germany, France, and the US, and their presence in other countries as colonizers does not get talked about as much as America sort of being the loudest, most obnoxious version of colonization. but obviously England too.
I was just going to say, or indeed the UK. Yeah, no, totally. We had two questions about kind of intertwining, the kind of intermingling of stories. So Lynette would love to hear more about how you developed the intertwining stories as a process for writing and as a way of developing these characters and telling the story. And then we had another question. I'm just going to get, we had all the comments about where people are. Yeah, oh, she asked it again. So she really wants you to answer it.
This is the question about the
intertwining stories as a process for writing the novel. And she loved the novel, so, she says.
Thank you, Lynette. I always wanted, that when I first started writing the novel, I wanted it to be this kind of novel of, I didn't come into it as part of the process. I didn't like start a bunch of different stories and then try to throw them together. I very much wanted it to be a story about a lot of stories and how they related to one another. Them coming together and sort of the braiding work is not fun. But having a sort of ending point that I started with, the sort of cataclysmic ending at an Oakland powwow, was the seed for the whole premise for the book. And having that was really convenient, I'm finding, because I'm writing another complicated novel, and not having that sort of tying element to pull everything through. It was a huge difference. And so it's, it's messier for me this time and harder to understand what is pulling it all together. So I can't really speak to, I can only say that it was difficult and I wanted to do it. So I asked for it. But it's, you want to make something that's readable and understandable and connects to a reader, and to ask them to do the work of holding a lot of voices and people is a lot. It can be a lot to ask of a reader. So you have to try to do the work to do that in as clear a way as possible.
You've alluded to kind of mysteriously now twice your second book. Can you tell us a little bit about its relation to there? Is it the sequel? What is it kind of about?
Yeah, it's the sequel. And it's sort of a prequel and a sequel at the same time, because we have a historical piece that ties to the characters in there. And it ties to the boarding schools and Southern Cheyenne history, which is, I'm enrolled in the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, but we're specifically Southern Cheyenne, which are these two tribes just, ended up together as part of the same tribe as far as what the federal government recognizes. But we're Southern Cheyenne, and there's this Southern Cheyenne that's specific to the origin of the boarding schools, which started at a prison castle in Florida. General Richard Henry Pratt sort of got the idea for the boarding schools by having these prisoners for 3 years and seeing them, as prisoners able to reform or become civilized, and then decided to apply that to children. And that was very popular, and killing the Indian to save the man became a very popular idea. And these schools just grew and grew. And then you have the legacies of how awful those schools were and how they were cultural genocide playing out over the generations leading up to, the present day. So it's about the aftermath of the powwow that ends in there, and sort of this antecedent to a lot of modern native lives, which is the boarding schools.
This reminds me of kind of your haunting opening quote. I mean, sprinkled throughout the book are these fantastically selected, as Robert kind of mentioned. It's so literary, the people that you're quoting. So you're quoting Brecht, you're quoting Baudelaire, you're quoting Stein, and don't worry, you don't have to be a Stein fan to speak in Paris. I just want to read it. I guess I'll read it twice, because I think it kind of also gets to the sense of you writing kind of musically. So I'm sure you know it. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times, by Brecht. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. Do you feel that the kind of musicality, and do you feel that you're continuing to sing, and do you feel that the times are indeed continue to be dark?
I would hope that everyone agrees that we are indeed in dark times now. If didn't ring as true in 2018, it definitely would, I think, for everyone now. And I think we need to hold on to the hope that singing will still happen, even if it's about the dark times, because I think we need art to do what it can do for us internally in times where it can feel really hopeless and we can feel really powerless. I think sometimes having art, whether that be film or music or literature, can be really important in the dark times, just as movie watching and alcohol sales go up during depression times. I think art can play a similar role as a salve.
What art do you turn to then when you're feeling that times are particularly dark?
Yeah, I like watching TV shows and movies, and I love reading. I try to keep reading as much as I can. All forms. I'm not really that much of a visual, like I don't like admire paintings. I can't really say that I'm that much of a visual art person in terms of like my knowledge or how much experience I have with it. I'm definitely not like anti-painting. But I think music for sure, all the time, reading a ton, and movies and TV also can provide a particular type of medicine.
You mentioned also, I'd be so curious, what is your writing schedule? So you mentioned that it takes a kind of discipline, and it's always interesting, to kind of glimpse on the other side of the more kind of materialistic process. Do you get up early? I mean, so a kind of non-disclaimer, right? You're tuning in, and for you, it's now 10:30 in the morning.
Now it's 11:30.
Now it's okay. But when I said I apologize for the earliness, you said no, this isn't early. Does that mean you're getting up early to write? I mean, what is your writing schedule?
I think I probably would be writing at my best between like 6 and 8. That's how There started. I would write before work. I would get up about 6 and write until about 8. And a lot of the early voices just came sort of flying out in the first year of writing it during that time period. And I think something happening in my brain is really conducive for language during that time. But right now, my discipline is not allowed that. So it's more like between like, I noticed I've gone into my revision history recently because I can be really destructive and it sort of delete parts of stuff that I end up having to go back for. So in Google Docs, you go to your revision history, you can go back to different days. And so I noticed the times that I'm writing the most, this was just fact, like finding out from looking at revision history, between 9 and 11 a.m. and 9 and 11 p.m. is when are my most concentrated times. Those are just the facts. I would like to say that I was getting up super early and was more disciplined, but that hasn't been the case. So
I think that's still fairly disciplined, especially at a time when it's hard to find some kind of schedule. Well, listen, Tommy, I'm looking at the clock and it is in fact 8:30 here, 11:30 for you, some kind of 30 for everyone else. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Thank you to Robert. I hope you'll join us back on. Thank you so much.